The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement of Riverside Park, where Margaret Hayes sat on her usual bench near the fountain. At 73 years old, her weathered hands clutched a tattered blanket around her shoulders, protection against the early autumn chill that seemed to seep into her bones more easily with each passing year. She had called this park home for the better part of 3 years, ever since the medical bills from her husband's cancer treatment had consumed their savings and eventually their small house on Maple Street. The streets had a way of making people invisible, and Margaret had learned to navigate that invisibility with quiet dignity, never asking for much, never causing trouble, simply existing in the margins of a world that had forgotten her. Across town, the Iron Phoenix Motorcycle Club was preparing for their annual charity ride, 100 riders strong, their chrome machines gleaming under the morning light in the parking lot of Eddie's Diner. These weren't the stereotypical outlaws that movies portrayed, but rather a diverse group of professionals, veterans, teachers, and working-class folks who shared a passion for the open road and a commitment to giving back to their community. Marcus Bear Thompson, the club president and a decorated Marine veteran, stood before the assembled riders, his gravel voice carrying across the lot as he outlined the day's route. They would ride through downtown, making stops at the Children's Hospital and the Veterans Center before ending at the community shelter where they deliver donated supplies and share a meal with those in need. The ride was meant to honor Bear's late sister, who had devoted her life to social work before losing her battle with addiction. Every year, the club members wore purple ribbons on their jackets in her memory, a reminder that anyone could fall on hard times, that dignity wasn't determined by address or bank balance. Among the riders was Jessica Chen, an emergency room nurse who rode a vintage Harley her father had restored. There was Thomas Rodriguez, a high school teacher who used his summers to volunteer at homeless shelters. Sarah Mitchell, a lawyer who provided pro bono services to those who couldn't afford representation. Each rider carried their own story, their own reason for being there, but they were united by a belief that their community was only as strong as its most vulnerable members. As the engines roared to life, creating a thunderous symphony that echoed through the streets, Margaret was making her way toward the small grocery store on Fifth Avenue. She had saved enough coins from recycling cans to buy a loaf of bread and perhaps some peanut butter if the store had any on sale. Her journey took her past the old courthouse, its marble steps worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, past the shuttered factory where her husband had once worked, past the memories of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. She moved slowly, her arthritic knees protesting each step, but she maintained her posture, her head held high despite the burden of circumstance that weighed upon her. The park where Margaret spent most of her days was beginning to fill with the usual weekend crowd. Families spread blankets for picnics, children chased each other around the playground equipment, and couples strolled hand in hand along the tree-lined paths. Most people never noticed Margaret, their eyes sliding past her as if she were just another fixture of the landscape, no more remarkable than the benches or trash cans. But today was different. Today, 3 young men in their 20s entered the park with swagger in their steps and malice in their hearts, looking for entertainment at someone else's expense, looking for someone too weak to fight back, someone the world had already decided didn't matter. Kyle Morrison and his 2 friends, Derek and Justin, had spent the morning drinking cheap beer and scrolling through videos on their phones, feeding off each other's bravado and stupidity. They were products of privilege who had never known real hardship, whose parents had always smoothed over their mistakes with money and connections, shielding them from consequences that might have taught them empathy or decency. Kyle had been expelled from 3 colleges, not for lack of intelligence but for a pattern of bullying and harassment that finally caught up with him. Derek worked sporadically at his uncle's car dealership, more interested in filming pranks for social media than building any kind of future. Justin was the follower, desperate for acceptance from anyone who would have him, willing to abandon his own moral compass for the illusion of belonging. They had been watching videos of cruel pranks, clips where young people harassed the homeless for laughs and likes, content that rewarded cruelty and normalized dehumanization. Kyle had been filming similar content for weeks, his channel growing slowly but steadily, each video pushing boundaries a little further, each comment section filling with emojis and encouragement from strangers who confused shock value with entertainment. They needed something big, something that would go viral, something that would finally get them the attention they craved. When they spotted Margaret sitting alone on her bench, feeding breadcrumbs to the pigeons from a small bag she kept in her coat pocket, Kyle smiled that particular smile that his mother had long ago stopped trying to correct, the one that signaled someone was about to suffer for his amusement. Derek pulled out his phone and started recording as they approached. Margaret looked up as they surrounded her bench, their shadows falling across her weathered face. She had seen trouble before, had developed instincts for danger during her years on the streets, and everything about these young men set off alarm bells in her mind. She clutched her small bag of belongings closer, a gesture that seemed to amuse Kyle, who laughed and asked her what she was protecting in that dirty old bag. Margaret remained silent, knowing that engagement often escalated situations, hoping they would lose interest and move on to easier targets. But silence wasn't what Kyle wanted. He wanted a reaction, wanted content for his channel, wanted to prove to his friends and his followers that he was fearless, that rules didn't apply to him, that other people's pain was nothing more than raw material for his entertainment. What happened next unfolded with shocking speed. Kyle reached out and snatched the bag from Margaret's hands, dumping its contents onto the ground with exaggerated disgust. Her few possessions scattered across the pavement, a photo of her late husband, a small toiletry kit, a bundle of letters tied with string, the remnants of a life compressed into items that could fit in a grocery bag. When Margaret bent to retrieve her husband's photo, the only image she had left of him, Kyle kicked it away, sending it skittering across the concrete. Margaret's hands trembled as she crawled after it, and something in Kyle's alcohol-soaked brain interpreted her desperation as comedy. He looked back at Derek, making sure the camera was still rolling, and then he did the unthinkable. He raised his hand and struck Margaret across the face, the sound of the slap echoing across the park like a gunshot, followed immediately by his laughter and Justin's nervous chuckle. Margaret fell sideways off the bench, her frail body unable to absorb the impact. Blood trickled from her split lip as she lay on the ground, too stunned and hurt to immediately rise. The few people nearby froze in shock, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. A mother pulled her children close, shielding their eyes. An elderly man reached for his phone, his hands shaking too badly to dial. The world seemed to pause, holding its breath, waiting for someone to act, for someone to step forward and restore the moral order that had just been so violently disrupted. Kyle stood over Margaret, still laughing, still recording, completely unaware that the universe was about to deliver a lesson in consequences that no parent or institution had ever been able to teach him. The sound that came next changed everything. It started as a distant rumble, like thunder approaching from the horizon, growing steadily louder until the ground itself seemed to vibrate with it. 100 motorcycles, their engines synchronized in an unintentional chorus of mechanical fury, rounded the corner into Riverside Park. The Iron Phoenix Motorcycle Club had decided to make an unscheduled stop, Bear having spotted the park's war memorial and wanting to pay respects before continuing their route. But as the riders entered the park and began to slow, as their engines quieted from roar to rumble, dozens of eyes locked onto the scene unfolding near the fountain. They saw an elderly black woman on the ground, bleeding. They saw 3 young men standing over her, one holding a phone, all of them laughing. They saw the scattered possessions, the overturned bench, the crowd of bystanders frozen in shock. And in that moment, every single rider understood exactly what had happened, and exactly what needed to happen next. Bear killed his engine first, the sudden silence from his bike creating a ripple effect as 99 other riders followed suit. The parking lot's rumble dissolved into an eerie quiet broken only by the fountain's gentle splash and Kyle's trailing laughter, which died in his throat as he realized something fundamental had shifted in his environment. He turned to see a wall of leather and chrome, 100 faces locked onto him with expressions that ranged from disgust to barely contained rage. Derek's phone hand dropped slowly to his side as the reality of their situation began to penetrate his alcohol-fogged brain. Justin took an involuntary step backward, his survival instincts finally overriding his need for peer approval. Bear dismounted with the fluid motion of someone who had been riding for decades, his boots hitting the pavement with deliberate weight. At 6'4" and 250 pounds of muscle earned through years of military service and maintained through discipline, he was an imposing figure made more so by the absolute certainty in his movements. Behind him, the other riders began to dismount, creating a semicircle that expanded outward like a noose tightening around Kyle and his friends. Jessica Chen moved immediately to Margaret, kneeling beside her with the practiced efficiency of someone who had treated countless trauma patients. Sarah Mitchell already had her phone out, not to record but to call the police, her lawyer's mind cataloging every detail of the scene for the inevitable legal proceedings. Thomas Rodriguez positioned himself between the 3 young men and the rest of the riders, not to protect the perpetrators but to ensure nothing happened that would compromise the moral high ground. Bear approached slowly, each step measured, his face a mask of controlled fury that was somehow more terrifying than any display of rage could have been. Kyle tried to muster some of his earlier bravado, opening his mouth to speak, perhaps to joke his way out of the situation as he had done so many times before with principals and deans and his parents' friends. But the words died unspoken when he met Bear's eyes and saw something that his privileged life had never prepared him to face: genuine consequence delivered by someone who could not be bought, charmed, or intimidated. "What's your name?" Bear's voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried across the park with perfect clarity. Kyle stammered out his name, then immediately wished he hadn't, wished he could take it back, wished he had the power to rewind the last 10 minutes and make different choices. Bear nodded slowly, as if Kyle had just confirmed something he already knew, some fundamental truth about character and cowardice. Kyle Morrison. That's a name people are going to remember. Not the way you wanted, but they'll remember it. Tell me, Kyle, does it make you feel powerful, hitting a 73-year-old woman who can't defend herself? Does it make you feel like a man? The question hung in the air, rhetorical but demanding. Kyle's face had gone from flushed with excitement to pale with fear, sweat beading on his forehead despite the autumn chill. Derek tried to edge away, but found his path blocked by a wall of riders who had silently closed ranks. Justin had started crying, quiet tears streaming down his face as the magnitude of what they had done finally penetrated his consciousness. Behind Bear, Jessica had helped Margaret to a sitting position, speaking to her in soft, reassuring tones while examining the cut on her lip and checking for signs of concussion. Margaret's hands still trembled, but her eyes had cleared, and she watched the unfolding scene with an expression that mixed pain with something that might have been hope, might have been vindication, might have been the simple relief of knowing that someone had finally seen her, had finally recognized that what happened to her mattered. Here's what's going to happen, Bear continued, his voice still quiet but now carrying an edge that suggested arguing would be the worst decision Kyle had ever made, worse even than what had brought him to this moment. First, you're going to apologize. A real apology, not the kind you've given principals and parents where you're really just sorry you got caught. You're going to look this woman in the eyes and tell her you're sorry for assaulting her, for stealing her belongings, for treating her like she doesn't matter. Then you're going to pick up every single item you scattered and return them to her. And then you're going to sit on that bench and wait for the police to arrive, because there are about 20 phones recording you right now, and there's no running from this. Kyle's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, his brain still searching for the escape hatch that had always appeared before, the adult who would make excuses for him, the connection who would make the problem disappear, the money that would smooth everything over. But the escape hatch wasn't there, wouldn't be there, because the people surrounding him operated by different rules, rules that said actions had consequences, that dignity wasn't negotiable, that protection and privilege couldn't shield you from accountability forever. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, called by multiple witnesses whose frozen shock had finally thawed into action. The riders remained motionless, their presence a silent statement that justice would be served today, one way or another, that this space was now protected, that Margaret would not be victimized again, not while they drew breath. The apology, when it finally came, was pathetic and insufficient, but it was witnessed and recorded by dozens of people who would ensure Kyle Morrison's actions followed him far beyond this park. Margaret sat on the bench, Jessica still kneeling beside her with a first aid kit retrieved from one of the bikes, cleaning the blood from her lip with gentle precision. Margaret's eyes never left Kyle's face as he stammered through his words, and when he finished, she said nothing at all, offering neither forgiveness nor condemnation, simply existing in her dignity while he drowned in his shame. Derek and Justin stood beside him, their earlier bravado completely evaporated, replaced by the sick realization that their lives had just fundamentally changed, that this moment would define them in ways they were only beginning to understand. The police arrived in multiple vehicles, their lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. Officers emerged with hands on their belts, initially uncertain about the situation given the crowd of bikers, but the scene before them quickly resolved into clarity. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her lawyer credentials establishing immediate credibility, and provided a concise summary of events supported by multiple video recordings from the riders' phones. The officers interviewed witnesses, including the mother who had shielded her children and the elderly man who had tried to call for help. Kyle, Derek, and Justin were separated and questioned individually, their stories contradictory and self-serving, undermined by the incontrovertible evidence of their own recorded video, which Derek had been too shocked to delete. While the police processed the arrests, something remarkable began to happen around Margaret. The bikers, these strangers who had arrived by chance and stayed by choice, began to treat her not as a victim to be pitied but as a person to be honored. Bear pulled up a cooler from one of the bike trailers and offered Margaret a cold bottle of water, which she accepted with hands that were finally beginning to steady. Thomas approached with a blanket, far warmer and cleaner than the threadbare one she had been wearing, and draped it gently across her shoulders. Jessica finished treating her injuries and handed her a card with the clinic's information, making her promise to come in for a follow-up examination. Others gathered Margaret's scattered belongings with reverence, treating her meager possessions as if they were precious artifacts, because in that moment they understood that these items were precious, were the physical anchors to a life and love that deserved respect. Marcus Bear Thompson sat down on the bench beside Margaret, not too close, respecting her space but offering his presence. They sat in silence for a long moment, two people from different worlds united by this unexpected intersection of circumstances. Finally, Bear spoke, his voice gentler than it had been when addressing Kyle, carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much suffering in his life to dismiss anyone else's pain. My name is Marcus Thompson, but everyone calls me Bear. I want you to know that what happened to you today was wrong, completely wrong, and those boys are going to face consequences for it. But I also want you to know that you matter. Your life matters. Your dignity matters. And I'm sorry that the world has let you fall through the cracks. Margaret turned to look at him, her eyes swimming with tears that hadn't fallen when she was struck but fell now in response to simple kindness, simple recognition of her humanity. I haven't heard someone say my name in so long, she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. People look right through me now. It's like I stopped being real when I lost my house, like I stopped being Margaret Hayes and became just another homeless woman, just another problem for other people to step around. Bear nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for more words, the understanding of someone who had seen friends return from war and end up on the streets, who knew how thin the line was between security and catastrophe, how quickly circumstances could strip away everything except the core of who you were. Jessica approached with her phone, showing Margaret something that made the older woman's eyes widen. The nurse had been quietly researching while treating Margaret's injuries, and she had found a program specifically designed to help senior citizens transition out of homelessness, a program with emergency housing available and caseworkers who specialized in navigating the bureaucratic maze of social services. More than that, Jessica had already made calls, using her connections in the medical community to expedite Margaret's application, to ensure that this moment of intervention became a turning point rather than just another story of temporary kindness that faded as quickly as it appeared. If you're willing, Jessica said, we can get you into temporary housing by tonight, start working on permanent solutions by Monday. You don't have to live on these streets anymore, Margaret. Not if you don't want to. The weight of possibility hung in the air, fragile as glass, precious as hope. Margaret's hand rose to her chest, pressing against her heart as if to verify it was still beating, still capable of feeling something beyond the numb acceptance of chronic hardship. Around them, the bikers had formed a protective circle, their presence keeping the curious crowd at a respectful distance, creating a bubble of safety within which Margaret could make this decision without pressure or performance. She looked at the faces surrounding her, these strangers who had become champions, these ordinary people who had chosen to act when action was required. She thought of her husband, of the life they had built together, of the dignity they had maintained even in poverty, and she knew what he would tell her to say, knew that accepting help wasn't weakness but wisdom, that holding on to pride at the expense of survival was a luxury she could no longer afford. 3 months after that day in Riverside Park, Margaret Hayes stood in the doorway of her new apartment, a modest one-bedroom in a senior housing complex subsidized by the city and supported by a network of social services that Jessica Chen had helped her navigate. The walls were painted a soft cream color, warm and clean, and sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked a small garden where residents grew vegetables and flowers. It wasn't the house on Maple Street that she had lost, but it was hers, secure and safe, a place where she could lock the door against the world and know that she had somewhere to return to, always. On her small dining table sat framed photographs retrieved from storage, including the picture of her husband that Kyle had kicked across the pavement, now preserved behind new glass. The journey from that bench to this apartment had not been easy or straightforward. There had been paperwork that seemed endless, interviews that dredged up painful memories, bureaucratic delays that tested her patience and resolve. But through it all, the Iron Phoenix Motorcycle Club had remained constant supporters, checking in regularly, helping her navigate systems designed more to discourage than to help, showing up at appointments when she needed advocates, providing meals and toiletries and the thousand small necessities that most people never thought about. Bear had become something like the son she had never had, calling weekly to chat about everything and nothing, treating her like family rather than charity. Jessica coordinated her medical care, ensuring that her arthritis received treatment and her mental health got the support she needed after years of trauma. The legal proceedings against Kyle Morrison, Derek Vaughan, and Justin Peters had concluded with convictions on multiple charges including assault, battery, and elder abuse. Kyle received the harshest sentence, 18 months in county jail, 5 years probation, and 1,000 hours of community service to be served at homeless shelters. Derek and Justin received lighter sentences but faced civil suits from Margaret that Sarah Mitchell had filed on her behalf, seeking compensation for medical expenses and emotional distress. But more damaging than any legal penalty was the social consequence. The video that Derek had been recording went viral not as entertainment but as evidence, shared across news outlets and social media, with the biker's intervention providing a powerful counter-narrative about accountability and justice. Kyle's parents' connections couldn't protect him from the court of public opinion, couldn't erase his name from internet searches that would haunt him for years. More importantly, the incident had sparked a broader conversation about how society treated its most vulnerable members. The city council, responding to public pressure generated by the viral story, allocated additional funding for homeless services and senior support programs. Local news stations ran follow-up segments about the hidden population of elderly homeless individuals, many of them women, many of them victims of circumstances beyond their control. Churches and community organizations launched initiatives to provide not just meals but connections, recognizing that isolation was as dangerous as hunger. The Iron Phoenix Motorcycle Club expanded their charity rides to include regular visits to homeless encampments, providing not just supplies but presents, treating every person they encountered with the same dignity they had shown Margaret. On this particular Saturday, Margaret was preparing for visitors. The club was gathering for what had become a monthly tradition, lunch at her apartment, where a dozen riders would crowd into her small space, bringing food and stories and laughter that filled the rooms with life. Margaret had learned to cook again, finding joy in preparing dishes for people who appreciated them, who treated her cooking as a gift rather than a service. She moved around her kitchen with purpose, her arthritis still present but managed with medication she could now afford, her movements slower than they once were but no longer burdened by the weight of hopelessness that had defined her years on the street. As she worked, Margaret thought about the strange mathematics of blessing and tragedy, how the worst moment of her life had somehow led to its redemption. She thought about Kyle Morrison sometimes, wondered if his time in jail was teaching him the empathy that freedom had never required of him, wondered if he would emerge changed or simply more careful about being caught. She had forgiven him, not because he deserved it but because carrying anger was exhausting, and she had been tired for so long that letting go felt like its own kind of freedom. She hoped he would learn, would change, would find a way to transform his shame into something useful. But whether he did or didn't, her life would continue forward, no longer defined by what had been done to her but by what she chose to do with the opportunities that intervention had created. The rumble of motorcycles announced the arrival of her guests, that familiar sound that would always carry echoes of rescue, of righteousness, of regular people choosing to act when action mattered most. Margaret smoothed her dress, checked her reflection in the mirror, and saw not a homeless woman or a victim but herself. Margaret Hayes, 73 years old, survivor, human being worthy of dignity and respect. She opened her door to find Bear standing there with a bouquet of flowers and that gentle smile that somehow fit on his intimidating face. Behind him, the hallway filled with riders, their leather jackets adorned with purple ribbons, their arms full of dishes and desserts and the ingredients for an afternoon of fellowship. "Come in," Margaret said, her voice strong and clear, welcoming them into the home that their intervention had made possible, the home that represented not just shelter but the restoration of her humanity. As they filed in, filling her apartment with noise and warmth and belonging, Margaret felt something she had not felt in years: hope for tomorrow, gratitude for today, and the profound peace that comes from being seen, being valued, being remembered not as a victim or a problem or an invisible shadow on society's margins, but as Margaret Hayes, a woman whose life had worth, whose story had meaning, whose dignity could not be stolen by cruelty because enough good people had decided it was worth defending. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, full of possibility, proof that sometimes justice arrives on 2 wheels and 100 strong, that sometimes the world bends back toward righteousness, that sometimes the forgotten are remembered and the broken find ways to heal, one small act of decency at a time.